An orphan helped an old woman cross the street, never knowing she'd be adopted by her. That single act of kindness on a bitter December morning would alter the course of 12-year-old Ellie Morgan's life forever, though neither she nor the elderly woman with silver hair and trembling hands could possibly have known it then. Ellie pulled her thin jacket tighter around her narrow shoulders as she hurried along the sidewalk, the frosty air biting at her cheeks and turning the tip of her nose pink. 6 months in the St. Catherine's home for children had taught her to walk with her head down, to make herself smaller, less noticeable in a world that seemed determined to look past her. The weight of her backpack, containing everything she owned, 3 worn books, 2 changes of clothes, a tattered stuffed rabbit missing one eye, and a single photograph of parents whose faces had begun to blur in her memory, pressed against her spine. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and she was running late. Again, Ms. Winters, the house mother with perpetually pursed lips and eyes that rarely softened, had made it clear that one more tardy slip from school would mean kitchen duty for a week. Ellie quickened her pace, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated in the morning air. That's when she saw her, an elderly woman standing at the curb, one gnarled hand clutching a worn wooden cane, the other gripping a plastic grocery bag that seemed too heavy for her frail frame. The woman was peering anxiously at the traffic signal, which had just turned green for crossing, but she remained frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, hesitating. Ellie slowed her steps. She would definitely be late now, but something in the woman's uncertain posture tugged at her. The other pedestrians streamed past, their collars turned up against the cold, eyes fixed on phone screens or the middle distance, unseeing. The traffic light began its countdown. 15 seconds, 14, 13... With a sigh that held both resignation and resolve, Ellie approached the woman. "Excuse me, ma'am? Would you like some help crossing?" The woman turned, startled, revealing a face mapped with lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. Her eyes, a clear hazel that seemed too bright for her weathered face, widened slightly in surprise. "Oh dear. Yes, that would be very kind of you." Her voice was soft, slightly tremulous, like wind through autumn leaves. Ellie offered her arm, feeling awkward but determined. The woman's fingers, cold despite her knitted gloves, curled around Ellie's forearm with surprising strength. "Ready?" Ellie asked, glancing at the countdown. 8 seconds. The woman nodded, and together they stepped off the curb. They moved slowly, the woman's cane tapping a steady rhythm against the asphalt. Ellie matched her pace, acutely aware of the seconds ticking down and the impatient rumble of car engines waiting for the light to change. "My name is Margaret," the woman offered as they reached the halfway point. "Margaret Lancaster." "I'm Ellie," she replied, surprised by the introduction. Adults rarely bothered to exchange names with her. They reached the opposite curb just as the light changed, and the waiting cars surged forward. Ellie made to pull away, but Margaret's hand tightened slightly on her arm. "Would you mind?" Margaret began, then paused, seeming to gather her courage. "My bags are rather heavy, and my apartment is just down this block. Would it be too much trouble to ask for your help a bit further?" Ellie hesitated, thinking of Ms. Winter's warning and the tardy slip that would surely be waiting for her now. But there was something in Margaret's eyes, a mixture of pride and vulnerability, that made it impossible to refuse. "Sure," she said, reaching for the plastic grocery bag. "I can help." Margaret's smile transformed her face, softening the deep lines around her mouth and lighting her eyes. "Bless you, child. It's not far." They walked slowly down the block, Ellie carrying the grocery bag that contained only a few items: a small carton of milk, a loaf of bread, a tin of tea, and what looked like a single apple. Barely enough for one person, Ellie thought, feeling a pang of recognition. She knew what it was to make little stretch further. "Do you live nearby?" Margaret asked, her cane tapping a steady rhythm beside them. "At St. Catherine's?" Ellie answered, the words coming out more clipped than she'd intended. She rarely mentioned the home to outsiders. Margaret's steps faltered momentarily. "The children's home? On Maple Street?" Ellie nodded, bracing herself for the pitying look that usually followed such revelations. But Margaret's expression held something different, a flash of understanding that made Ellie wonder what stories lay behind those hazel eyes. "I see," was all Margaret said, and they continued in silence until they reached a modest apartment building with faded brick and a small, well-kept entryway. "This is me," Margaret said, pausing at the front steps. "Apartment 2B, just on the first floor, thank goodness." These old knees couldn't manage much more. Ellie handed back the grocery bag, suddenly aware that she was now very late for school. Would you like to come in for a moment? Margaret interrupted, her voice hesitant. I have some cookies I baked yesterday, as a thank you for your help. The offer caught Ellie off guard. The thought of fresh-baked cookies made her stomach rumble. Breakfast at St. Catherine's had been watery oatmeal that did little to sustain her through the morning. But school? I'm already late for school, she admitted. And if I get another tardy slip, I'll be in trouble. Margaret nodded, understanding but visibly disappointed. Of course. School is important. She fumbled in her coat pocket and produced a small, neatly folded handkerchief. Carefully unwrapping it, she revealed 2 chocolate chip cookies wrapped in wax paper. At least take these for your lunch. A small token of my appreciation. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle, that Ellie felt her throat tighten. When was the last time anyone had given her something without expectation? She accepted the cookies with a murmured thanks, tucking them carefully into her jacket pocket. Perhaps, Margaret said, then seemed to reconsider. Well, if you're ever passing by again, my door is always open for a cup of tea. Ellie nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Then, with a quick wave, she turned and hurried back toward the main street, breaking into a run as soon as she rounded the corner. The tardy slip was waiting for her at school, as expected. So was the week of kitchen duty that followed. But as Ellie scrubbed pots and sorted silverware in St. Catherine's industrial kitchen each afternoon, her mind kept returning to the elderly woman with hazel eyes who had offered cookies and an open door. 3 days later, walking home from school, Ellie found herself taking a detour. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more, that led her feet toward the faded brick apartment building. She stood across the street for several minutes, watching the entrance, half hoping to catch a glimpse of silver hair or a wooden cane. When neither appeared, she finally turned away, feeling foolish. But the next day, she took the same detour. And the next. On the 4th day, as she stood hesitating on the sidewalk, the front door of the building opened, and Margaret emerged, moving slowly with her cane. She was wearing the same navy blue coat, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. Before Ellie could decide whether to approach or retreat, Margaret looked up and saw her. Surprise registered on her face, followed by unmistakable pleasure. "Ellie!" she called, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "What a lovely surprise!" Caught, Ellie crossed the street, feeling a blush warm her cheeks. "I was just passing by," she said, the lie transparent even to her own ears. Margaret's smile widened, crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Well, I'm very glad you were. I was just about to make some tea and could use the company if you're not in a hurry." Ellie should have been heading back to St. Catherine's for dinner and study hall, but the thought of another evening in the noisy common room, trying to concentrate amid the chaos of 20 other children, made her decision easy. "I have some time," she said. Margaret's apartment was small but immaculate, with furniture that spoke of a different era. Heavy wood pieces polished to a soft gleam, upholstery in faded floral patterns, and lace doilies placed carefully on end tables. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and framed photographs covered nearly every available surface. While Margaret busied herself in the tiny kitchen, Ellie found herself drawn to the photographs. Most showed a younger Margaret with a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. In some, they were joined by a boy with his father's build and his mother's eyes. "That's my Henry," Margaret said, appearing at Ellie's shoulder with a tray bearing a teapot, 2 cups, and a plate of cookies. "And our son James. Where are they now?" Ellie asked, then immediately regretted the question when a shadow passed over Margaret's face. "Henry passed away 5 years ago," Margaret said, setting the tray on a coffee table worn smooth by years of use. "Heart attack. Very sudden." She poured tea into delicate cups that looked too fragile for everyday use. "And James lives in California with his wife. They're very busy with their careers." The way she said it made Ellie think there was more to that story, but she didn't pry. Instead, she accepted the cup of tea, adding a spoonful of sugar when Margaret offered it. "Do you visit them?" she asked, taking a careful sip of the hot liquid. Margaret shook her head slightly. "It's difficult to travel at my age. And they have their own lives." She brightened with visible effort. "But we talk on the phone every Sunday. Now tell me about you. How long have you been at St. Catherine's?" Ellie stared down at her tea. 6 months. Since the accident." Margaret didn't press for details, and Ellie was grateful. Instead, the older woman began telling stories about the neighborhood, how it had changed over the 40 years she'd lived there, the characters who had come and gone, the small bakery on the corner that had once made the best cinnamon rolls in the city. Before Ellie realized it, an hour had passed, then 2. When she finally noticed the time, she jumped up in alarm. "I have to go. Dinner will be over, and I'll be in trouble again." Margaret looked distressed. "Oh dear, I've kept you too long. Will they be very angry?" Ellie was already gathering her backpack. "It's okay. I'll just say I was at the library studying." Another lie, but a necessary one. Margaret walked her to the door. "Will you come again?" she asked, her voice careful as if bracing for rejection. Ellie hesitated only briefly. "Yes. If that's okay?" "More than okay," Margaret assured her. "Perhaps Saturday? I could make lunch." The offer of a home-cooked meal was too tempting to refuse. "Saturday," Ellie agreed, as she hurried back to St. Catherine's. Ellie tried to make sense of the warm feeling spreading through her chest. It wasn't just the tea and cookies, or even the respite from the noise and rules of the home. It was the way Margaret had listened to her, really listened when she spoke. The way the older woman's eyes had lit up when she'd appeared at her door. It felt dangerously close to belonging. Saturday lunch became a ritual. Ellie would arrive at Margaret's apartment at noon, and they would share simple meals, soup and sandwiches, or sometimes a casserole that Margaret had prepared the night before. After eating, they would sit in the living room, Margaret knitting while Ellie read aloud from one of the many books that filled the shelves. Margaret never asked directly about the accident that had left Ellie an orphan, and Ellie didn't volunteer the information. But gradually, in bits and pieces, she found herself sharing other things. Her struggle to keep up with schoolwork amid the chaos of the home, her love of reading, her dream of one day becoming a writer. In turn, Margaret spoke of her life with Henry. Their travels before age and illness had confined them to the city, the garden she had once tended with pride. She rarely mentioned her son, and when she did, a certain tightness appeared around her mouth that Ellie came to recognize as unresolved pain. 3 weeks into their friendship, Ellie arrived at Margaret's apartment to find the older woman unusually quiet, her movements slower than normal, her face drawn. "Are you okay?" Ellie asked as they settled at the small kitchen table for lunch, tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches that smelled heavenly after a morning of standardized testing at school. Margaret attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just a bit under the weather, dear. Nothing to worry about." But Ellie did worry, especially when Margaret's hand trembled so badly that soup sloshed over the rim of her spoon. After lunch, the older woman sank into her armchair with visible relief, her breathing slightly labored. "Maybe I should go," Ellie suggested, concerned. "So you can rest." "No!" Margaret's response was unexpectedly vehement. She composed herself with visible effort. "I mean, please stay. Your company is the best medicine I could ask for." Ellie hesitated, then settled into her usual spot on the sofa. Instead of reading aloud as they usually did, she simply sat quietly, watching as Margaret's eyelids grew heavy and eventually closed. Soon, soft, even breathing indicated she had fallen asleep. Moving carefully to avoid waking her, Ellie gathered their lunch dishes and carried them to the sink. As she washed up, she noticed an orange prescription bottle on the counter, the label facing away from her. Beside it lay a notepad with a list written in Margaret's elegant, if slightly shaky, handwriting. "Dr. Levin, 2:30 Tuesday refill heart medication, call James, Sunday heart medication." The words sent a chill through Ellie. She remembered Margaret mentioning that her husband had died of a heart attack. Was history threatening to repeat itself? When Margaret awoke an hour later, Ellie was sitting across from her, pretending to read but really watching the rise and fall of the older woman's chest with each breath. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Margaret said, straightening in her chair with a wince. "I didn't mean to fall asleep on you." "It's okay," Ellie assured her. "Are you feeling better?" Margaret rubbed her left arm absently. "A bit, yes." Ellie gathered her courage. "I saw your note about heart medication. Is your heart okay?" A flash of surprise crossed Margaret's face, followed by resignation. "It's nothing serious. Just getting old, dear. The ticker doesn't work quite as well as it used to." But something in her tone made Ellie think she wasn't being entirely truthful. "Does your son know? James?" A shadow passed over Margaret's face. "James has enough to worry about with his job and his life in California. There's no need to trouble him with an old woman's health issues." "But if you're sick—" "I'm not sick," Margaret interrupted firmly. "Just old. There's a difference." Her expression softened. Now enough about me. Tell me about your test today. Was it as dreadful as you feared? The deliberate change of subject was obvious, but Ellie allowed it, launching into a description of the morning's standardized testing ordeal. Yet even as she talked, a new worry had taken root in her mind. What would happen to Margaret if she became seriously ill? Who would help her if Ellie wasn't around? The question haunted her in the weeks that followed. She began stopping by Margaret's apartment more frequently, after school for a quick check-in, sometimes in the mornings before classes if she could slip away from St. Catherine's early enough. Each time, she scanned the older woman's face for signs of fatigue or pain, noted whether her breathing seemed labored or her movements more restricted. Margaret tolerated these visits with amused patience, often shooing Ellie away with assurances that she was perfectly fine, just moving at an old lady's pace. But she never discouraged Ellie from coming, and her face always brightened visibly when the girl appeared at her door. One rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, Ellie arrived at the apartment to find Margaret sitting at her kitchen table, a pile of papers spread before her, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked up with a startled expression that quickly transformed into welcome. "Ellie, I wasn't expecting you today. I finished my homework at school," Ellie explained, shaking raindrops from her jacket. "What are you doing?" Margaret hesitated, then gestured to the chair across from her. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. I could use a young person's perspective." Curious, Ellie hung her wet jacket on the back of the door and joined Margaret at the table. The papers she now saw were some kind of legal documents, dense with text and official-looking seals. "I've been putting my affairs in order," Margaret explained, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Making sure everything is clear for when I'm gone." A cold knot formed in Ellie's stomach. "Are you dying?" The question came out more bluntly than she'd intended, fear making her voice sharp. Margaret's laugh was gentle. "Not imminently, dear. But at my age, it's wise to be prepared." She tapped one of the documents. "This is my will. Most of it is straightforward. The apartment and my savings will go to James, of course. But I have some personal items I'd like to designate specifically." She pulled a notepad toward her. "My wedding rings will go to James's wife for any future daughter or daughter-in-law. My books—" She paused, looking thoughtfully at Ellie. "I was thinking my books might go to someone who would truly appreciate them." Ellie's throat tightened as she realized what Margaret was suggesting. "Me?" Margaret nodded. "You've shown more interest in them than anyone else in my life. The way you handle them, the care you take when you read, they would be well loved with you." Tears pricked at Ellie's eyes, and she blinked rapidly to dispel them. The thought of inheriting Margaret's beloved books was both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because it meant Margaret trusted her with something precious. Terrible because it meant contemplating a world without Margaret in it. "I don't want your books," she said, her voice thick. "I don't want you to die." Margaret reached across the table and took Ellie's hand, her papery skin cool against Ellie's warm palm. "Oh, my dear girl, death comes for all of us eventually. The best we can hope for is that we've loved well and left something good behind." A tear escaped, rolling down Ellie's cheek. "But I just found you." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Margaret's eyes softened and she squeezed Ellie's hand. "And I'm so very glad you did," she said softly. "These past months have been a gift I never expected." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped across the table, the rain tapping gently against the windows. Finally, Margaret straightened, releasing Ellie's hand and reaching for her glasses. "Now, before we both dissolve into puddles, I have another matter to discuss with you." Her tone was deliberately lighter. "My birthday is next Saturday. I'll be turning 75, and I'd very much like it if you could come for a special lunch to celebrate." Ellie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, grateful for the change of subject. "Of course I'll come. I'll even bake you a cake." Margaret's eyebrows rose in amusement. "Do they let you use the kitchen at St. Catherine's?" "Not exactly," Ellie admitted. "But I could bring something. A present." "Your presence will be present enough," Margaret assured her. "Though I do have one special request." "Anything. Wear something nice. A dress if you have one." Ellie frowned slightly. She had exactly one dress, a navy blue affair with a Peter Pan collar that she wore only for the mandatory Sunday services at St. Catherine's. "Okay, but why? It's just us, right?" A mysterious smile played at the corners of Margaret's mouth. "Let's just say I'm feeling a bit formal in my old age." The week passed in a blur of school assignments and quiet anticipation. On Saturday morning, Ellie woke early, filled with a nervous energy she couldn't quite explain. She showered and carefully put on her navy dress, even taking the time to braid her hair neatly instead of pulling it back in her usual hasty ponytail. At breakfast, Ms. Winters eyed her suspiciously. "Where are you off to, all dressed up?" "Library," Ellie lied smoothly, having perfected this particular untruth over the past months. "They're having a special event for National Poetry Month, Ms." Winters looked skeptical but didn't press further. "Be back by dinner." "Yes, ma'am." On her way to Margaret's, Ellie stopped at a small florist shop she'd passed countless times but never entered. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, immediately enveloped by the sweet, heady scent of fresh flowers. "Can I help you?" asked the woman behind the counter, her hands busy arranging stems in a crystal vase. "I need a birthday present," Ellie explained. "For an elderly lady." The woman smiled. "Grandmother?" Ellie hesitated. "A friend." If the florist found this odd, she didn't show it. "What's your budget, sweetheart?" Ellie pulled out the small wad of bills she'd been saving from her meager allowance, mostly ones and a single 5. "This is all I have." The woman's expression softened. She took the money and counted it quickly. $12. "Let's see what we can do." 10 minutes later, Ellie left the shop clutching a small but cheerful arrangement of daisies and purple statice in a simple glass vase. It had cost exactly $12, though Ellie suspected the florist had added extra blooms when she wasn't looking. Margaret's building looked different somehow as Ellie approached, though she couldn't immediately identify why. It was only as she climbed the front steps that she realized the entrance hall had been freshly swept, and a small potted plant now sat beside the door. The building itself seemed to be celebrating Margaret's birthday. She knocked on apartment 2B, suddenly nervous. What if Margaret expected something more than the simple flowers she'd brought? What if... The door swung open, revealing Margaret dressed in a pale blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. Her silver hair was arranged more carefully than usual, and she wore a strand of pearls that Ellie had seen in photographs but never in person. "Ellie!" she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "Right on time, and don't you look lovely?" Before Ellie could respond, Margaret stepped back, revealing that they were not alone. A tall man in his 50s stood in the living room, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Beside him was a slender woman with carefully styled blonde hair and a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "James?" Ellie whispered, recognizing Margaret's son from the photographs. Margaret nodded, her eyes shining with something that might have been tears or triumph. "James and his wife Patricia came all the way from California for my birthday. Wasn't that wonderful of them?" There was a moment of awkward silence as everyone assessed each other. Ellie clutched her small bouquet, suddenly aware of how childish it must look. "So you're Ellie," James said finally, his voice deep like his father's in the photographs. "My mother has mentioned you in our calls." "All good things?" Margaret hastened to add. "Ellie has been a tremendous help to me these past months. A true friend when I needed one most." Patricia's smile remained fixed in place. "How lovely." "And from the children's home Margaret mentioned." "Catherine's, was it?" The way she said it made Ellie's cheeks burn. She lifted her chin slightly. "Yes, ma'am." Another awkward silence fell. Margaret clapped her hands together, breaking the tension. "Well, let's not all stand about in the entryway. Come in, Ellie. Those flowers are beautiful. Let me put them in water." She took the small arrangement, exclaiming over it as if it were the most exquisite bouquet she'd ever seen. James stepped aside to let Ellie enter the living room fully, his expression still guarded. "Mother says you've been reading to her," he said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. Ellie nodded. "From Mr. Dickens, mostly. We just finished Great Expectations." Something flickered in James's eyes, surprise perhaps, or reluctant approval. "That was my father's favorite." "I know," Ellie said quietly. "Margaret told me." In the kitchen, Margaret was arranging the daisies in a fresh vase, humming softly to herself. Patricia had followed her, and their voices drifted back to the living room in muted conversation. James cleared his throat. "I understand you've been checking on my mother regularly." "Yes, sir. May I ask why?" The question caught Ellie off guard. She fiddled with the hem of her dress, considering how to answer. "She helped me first," she said finally. "The day we met. And she's been kind to me ever since." "And what do you get out of it?" James pressed, his tone sharpening slightly. Anger flared in Ellie's chest, hot and sudden. "Not everything is about getting something," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Sometimes people are just good to each other because that's what people should do." James looked taken aback, then thoughtful. Before he could respond, Margaret returned from the kitchen, Patricia trailing behind her. "Lunch is almost ready," Margaret announced. "James, would you help me bring in the extra chair from the bedroom? Ellie, dear, would you mind setting the table? You know where everything is." The request was deliberate, Ellie realized, a way of establishing her place in this home, showing James and Patricia that she belonged here in some small way. She nodded and moved to the cabinet where Margaret kept her good dishes, the ones they used for their Saturday lunches. As she carefully laid out plates and silverware, she could hear Margaret and James speaking in low voices in the bedroom. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was intense, almost argumentative. Patricia busied herself in the kitchen, ostentatiously checking on the roast in the oven and avoiding Ellie's eyes. When Margaret and James returned, both wore neutral expressions that didn't quite hide the tension between them. The extra chair was placed at the table, and Margaret gestured for everyone to sit. "Before we eat," she said, remaining standing while the others took their seats, "I want to thank you all for being here today. James and Patricia for making the long journey from California, and Ellie for brightening my days these past months." She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I have something important to discuss with all of you." James's expression turned wary. "Mother, we agreed to wait until after lunch." Margaret waved away his concern. "Nonsense. It will hang over the meal like a cloud. Better to clear the air now." She turned to Ellie. "Dear, the reason I asked you to come today, dressed nicely, was because I wanted to introduce you to James and Patricia. And because I have a proposition for you." Ellie glanced uncertainly between the three adults. Patricia was studying her wineglass with intense focus, while James watched his mother with a mixture of resignation and concern. "What kind of proposition?" Ellie asked cautiously. Margaret straightened her shoulders, suddenly looking more commanding than her frail frame would suggest. "I would like to become your legal guardian." The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that Ellie could almost see spreading outward. She stared at Margaret, certain she had misheard. "You ... What?" "I want to adopt you, Ellie," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "To give you a home, a real home with me." James sighed heavily. "Mother, we've discussed this. Your health is perfectly adequate for raising a 12-year-old girl," Margaret interrupted. "Especially one as independent and capable as Ellie." Patricia spoke for the first time since they'd sat down. "Margaret, be reasonable. You live alone, you have a heart condition, and you're 75 years old today. How can you possibly take on the responsibility of a child?" "I'm not a baby," Ellie said quietly, finding her voice. "I don't need constant care. I can help around the house. I already do." All eyes turned to her, and she felt her face grow hot under their scrutiny. But she continued, the words tumbling out now that she'd started. "I help with the dishes and the groceries. I know when Margaret needs her medication and how she likes her tea. I can read to her when her eyes are tired, and I'm quiet when she needs to rest." She looked directly at James. "And I check on her every day, which is more than—" She stopped herself, horrified at what she'd been about to say. But James's expression showed he understood the unspoken accusation. "It's more than you do." A tense silence filled the room. Margaret was the first to break it, her voice soft but determined. "I've given this a great deal of thought. I've spoken with my doctor, with my lawyer, and with the administrators at St. Catherine's. Preliminary paperwork has already been filed." She looked at Ellie, her eyes gentle. "Assuming, of course, that this is something you want, Ellie." The question hung in the air, momentous and life-altering. Ellie's mind raced. To leave St. Catherine's, to have a real home with Margaret, to belong somewhere, to someone. It was everything she'd secretly dreamed of since the accident that took her parents. But Margaret's health, her age, the disapproval radiating from James and Patricia, the responsibility that would inevitably fall on Ellie's young shoulders. She began, then faltered. "You don't have to answer right now," Margaret assured her. "This is a big decision. Take some time to think about it." James stood abruptly. "Mother, this is madness. You can't possibly—" "James." Margaret's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "This is not up for debate. I am still of sound mind, whatever you may think of my judgment, and I have the right to make this decision. And when you can no longer care for her? When your health fails completely? What then?" James demanded. "Will she go back to the orphanage? Or are Patricia and I expected to take her in?" His words struck Ellie like physical blows. She pushed back her chair and stood, trembling slightly. "I should go." "Ellie, no." Margaret reached for her, but Ellie stepped back. "It's okay. I understand." She looked at James, then Patricia, her chin lifted in defiance despite the tears threatening to spill. "I would never expect anyone to take me in who doesn't want me. I've had enough of that already." With as much dignity as she could muster, she walked to the door, grabbed her jacket, and left, closing the door quietly behind her. Only when she reached the street did she allow the tears to fall, hot and fast, down her cheeks. She walked blindly, with no destination in mind except away. Away from the hope that had blossomed and withered in the space of minutes. Away from Margaret's kind offer and James's brutal pragmatism. Away from the brief, tantalizing glimpse of belonging that had been dangled before her. Eventually, she found herself in a small park several blocks from Margaret's apartment. She sank onto a bench, emotionally exhausted, and watched as families strolled along the paths, children chasing each other across the grass, parents calling out warnings and encouragements. Normal life, family life, a world she observed but never fully inhabited. She didn't know how long she sat there, long enough for the sun to begin its descent, casting long shadows across the park. Long enough for the initial storm of emotion to subside, leaving behind a dull ache of resignation. This was her life. Temporary connections, brief moments of hope, inevitable disappointment. Ellie. She looked up, startled, to find James Lancaster standing before her, his tall frame casting a shadow over the bench. She hadn't heard him approach. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "I've been looking for over an hour," he admitted. "Checked the library, your school, even St. Catherine's. This was my last guess before heading back to tell Mother I'd failed." He gestured to the space beside her on the bench. "May I?" Ellie shrugged, and he sat, leaving a careful distance between them. For a moment, neither spoke, both watching a young father push his daughter on a nearby swing. "My mother is one of the most stubborn people I've ever known," James said finally. "Once she sets her mind on something, there's no talking her out of it." Ellie remained silent, unsure where this was leading. "When I was 10, he continued, "I wanted a dog more than anything. Mother said no. Our apartment was too small. She worked full-time as a teacher. It wouldn't be fair to the animal. But I begged and pleaded, made promises I had no intention of keeping about walking it and feeding it and cleaning up after it." Despite herself, Ellie turned to look at him. His profile against the setting sun reminded her strongly of the photographs in Margaret's living room. Finally, Father intervened. He took me aside and explained that Mother wasn't saying no to hurt me. She was saying no because she understood the reality of the situation better than I did. She was being responsible even though it made me unhappy in the moment. He turned to meet Ellie's gaze directly. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" "That I'm like the dog?" Ellie asked, a hint of defiance creeping back into her voice. "A responsibility your mother doesn't fully understand?" James laughed, a short, surprised sound. "No. I'm saying I'm still that 10-year-old boy, thinking I know what's best for everyone, especially my mother." He sobered. "And Mother is still the responsible one, seeing things more clearly than I give her credit for." Ellie frowned, confused by this apparent reversal. "I don't understand." James sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that reminded Ellie poignantly of Margaret. "After you left, Mother and I had, let's call it a frank discussion. She pointed out, quite accurately, that I've been absent from her life for years, flying in for occasional visits but leaving her essentially alone." He looked down at his hands. "She told me how you found her, how you've been reading to her, checking on her, bringing brightness into her days. She said," he paused, his voice growing thick, "she said you've been more of a family to her these past months than I have in years." Ellie sat very still, hardly daring to breathe. "Was she wrong?" James asked quietly. Ellie considered the question carefully. I think sometimes family is just who shows up. Who stays? Who chooses each other over and over again?" James nodded slowly. "Yes, I think you're right." He straightened, turning to face her fully. "Ellie, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about you and your relationship with my mother that were unfair and, frankly, hypocritical." "It's okay," Ellie said automatically. "No, it's not. But I'd like to make it right if you'll let me." He took a deep breath. "If you truly want to live with my mother, to be her family in a legal, permanent way, then I won't stand in the way. In fact, I'll help make it happen." Hope flickered to life in Ellie's chest, small but persistent. "Really? Really? On one condition." The hope wavered. "What condition?" "That you'll let me help. Both of you." James looked out across the park, his expression thoughtful. "Patricia and I have been discussing moving back east for a while now. Her company has an office in Boston, just a few hours from here. Close enough to visit regularly, to be there when needed. Because of Margaret's health? Ellie asked. James nodded. Partly, but also because I'm realizing what I've missed by staying away. The time I can't get back with her. He smiled ruefully. And now it seems with you. Ellie considered this, turning the idea over in her mind. So we'd be, what? Some kind of family? You, Patricia, Margaret, and me? An unconventional one, perhaps. But yes, that's the general idea. The hope grew stronger, more substantial. And if something happened to Margaret? James met her gaze steadily. Then you would still have a home with us if you wanted it. You wouldn't go back to St. Catherine's. The words unlocked something in Ellie's chest, a tight, knotted fear she hadn't fully acknowledged until this moment. The fear of finding home, only to lose it again. I want to go back to Margaret now, she said, standing up. She's probably worried. James stood as well, relief evident in his posture. She is. She sent me with strict instructions not to return without you. As they walked back toward the apartment building, Ellie found herself matching her stride to James's longer one, just as she had matched Margaret's slower pace that first day at the crosswalk. Different rhythms, she thought, but somehow harmonizing. Margaret was waiting at the door when they arrived, her face anxious until she spotted them approaching together. Her expression transformed into one of such hope and joy that Ellie felt her own heart swell in response. You came back, Margaret said as they reached the entrance. Ellie nodded. James found me. We talked. And... Margaret looked between them, her hands clasped tightly together. Ellie glanced up at James, who gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to Margaret. If you still want to adopt me, I'd like that very much. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She opened her arms, and Ellie stepped into them, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and tea that had come to mean safety, acceptance, home. My dear girl, Margaret whispered against her hair. Nothing would make me happier. Over the next several months, the process of making Ellie legally Margaret's ward moved forward with surprising speed, facilitated by James's connections and Margaret's determination. St. Catherine's, while initially reluctant to release a child to an elderly guardian, eventually relented in the face of character references, financial assurances, and the undeniable bond between Ellie and Margaret. The spare bedroom in Margaret's apartment was transformed into Ellie's own space, painted a soft green at her request, furnished with a desk for homework, and filled with books migrated from the overstuffed shelves in the living room. For the first time since the accident, Ellie unpacked her backpack completely, arranging her few possessions in drawers and on shelves, no longer keeping them ready for a hasty departure. James and Patricia, true to their word, found a house in a Boston suburb and began the process of relocating from California. They visited every other weekend, gradually forming a tentative relationship with Ellie that grew warmer with each encounter. Patricia, initially reserved, proved to have a dry wit that made Ellie laugh, while James revealed a fondness for board games that led to epic Monopoly battles around Margaret's dining table. Life settled into new rhythms. School, home to Margaret's apartment, homework at the kitchen table while Margaret prepared dinner, evenings reading aloud or watching old movies on television. On weekends, when James and Patricia visited, outings to museums or parks, family dinners with conversations that stretched late into the evening, and through it all, the steady, growing certainty that this was real, that it would last, that Ellie had, against all odds, found her way home. 1 year to the day after their first meeting at the crosswalk, Ellie and Margaret stood before a judge in family court, James and Patricia beside them as witnesses. The judge, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked dark hair, reviewed the final paperwork before looking up with a smile. Well, everything appears to be in order, she said, setting down her pen. Margaret Lancaster, do you understand the responsibilities you are undertaking as legal guardian to Eleanor Morgan? Margaret, dressed in the same pale blue dress she'd worn on her birthday, nodded firmly. I do, Your Honor. And you, Eleanor, the judge continued, addressing Ellie directly. Do you wish to become the legal ward of Margaret Lancaster? Ellie, in a new dress purchased specially for this occasion, felt a lump form in her throat. She swallowed hard before answering, Yes, Your Honor. More than anything. The judge smiled. Then, by the authority vested in me by the state, I hereby declare this guardianship official and binding. She signed the document with a flourish. Congratulations to you both. Outside the courthouse, standing in the spring sunshine, Margaret pulled Ellie into a tight embrace. My dear, dear girl, she murmured. Now you're officially mine. Ellie hugged her back, careful as always of Margaret's fragile frame, but needing the physical confirmation of this new reality. "And you're mine," she whispered. James cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I think this calls for a celebration," he announced. "Lunch at Riverside Cafe? My treat." As they walked toward James's car, Ellie found herself between Margaret and James, her right hand held firmly in Margaret's left, her left spontaneously grasped by James's right. Connected, anchored, family. "You know," Margaret said thoughtfully as they walked, "I've been thinking about that day we met. How many little things had to align just perfectly for our paths to cross?" Ellie nodded. "If I hadn't been late for school that day, if I hadn't decided to brave the cold for a few groceries, if the light hadn't changed just when it did." They smiled at each other, acknowledging the beautiful improbability of it all. An orphan helped an old woman cross the street, Margaret mused, echoing the story's beginning. And somehow they both found their way home. Ellie squeezed her hand, feeling the future unfold before them like a road leading homeward. "Together?" she said softly. "We found it together."